We usually design complex systems, whether they're mechanical, digital, or legal, to be perfect, stable, and completely logical, right? But as you've probably noticed, the moment they actually hit the real world, their behavior becomes erratic. They get messy. They suddenly fill up with loopholes. And to understand why this happens, we literally cannot just blame human error. We have to look at the invisible structural forces at play. Forces that actually dictate failure long before a system is even turned on. Welcome to this explainer, where we'll be looking into exactly why that happens. There's this really deeply held belief we all kind of share. Equal rules promise predictable outcomes. We assume that if a system applies absolute, unbending laws to everyone in exactly the same way, well, that guarantees a stable, secure, and entirely predictable society. It's the foundational promise of the rule of law, the basic assumption that standardizing things produces perfect control. But the raw mechanics of reality dictate a totally different truth. Rigid systems actually cannot survive contact with reality. If a framework is completely unyielding, systemic collapse isn't just a possibility down the road, it's a structural guarantee. Paradoxically, the more absolute the rule, the more certain its destruction. To see how this works, consider a really simple physical system, a closed loop of rigid iron pipes. It's engineered to absolute perfection. Its one and only purpose is to flawlessly contain high-pressure fluid within fixed boundaries. There are no leaks, no weak points. The law of the pipe applies equally to every single drop of fluid inside, dictating a singular, unchanging path. Yet, there's a hidden structural force governing this whole architecture. For any rigid framework to survive increasing pressure, it must structurally mandate its own exceptions. To survive, it literally requires breaking its own rules. A perfectly closed system is a doomed system. Because here's the thing, the fluid inside isn't static. It constantly encounters unpredictable fluctuations in the real world, spikes in temperature, changes in volume, sudden shifts in velocity. This variable pressure is constantly pushing against those rigid iron boundaries, stressing them to their exact calculated limits. Being perfectly sealed is precisely what puts the whole system in imminent danger of shattering. And foundational legal frameworks operate under the exact same physics. Think about it. The fundamental philosophy of the law demands absolute consistency. Statutes and regulations are expected to apply to every single person and scenario without variation. Everyone is contained inside the exact same rigid structure, bound by the exact same unyielding iron framework. But look at the contrast. Legislation is incredibly slow, deliberate, and creates a fixed boundary. Meanwhile, an industrializing modern society is a rapid, chaotic, and totally volatile fluid. So you have a static container attempting to hold a highly dynamic, endlessly expanding reality. The friction between that rigid container and its volatile contents is continuous and it is rapidly escalating. The mathematical reality here is completely inescapable. Pressure requires a physical release. As society becomes more volatile, the pressure inside our rigid legal framework spikes. Without a physical release mechanism, the structural integrity of the whole thing will inevitably burst. The system must act to preserve itself, or it will fracture completely. So what does it do? The system engages in rational local optimization. It installs a pressure relief valve. It's a simple mechanism that allows just a fraction of the fluid to escape when the pressure hits a critical threshold. It's a deliberate, localized exception to the closed-loop rule designed entirely to prevent a catastrophic global rupture. To survive the immense volume, speed, and complexity of modern society, legal frameworks did exactly this. They built specialized release mechanisms. We call them administrative agencies. These were created to handle the massive overflow of highly specific, messy, everyday cases that strict, slow-moving courts just couldn't process fast enough. The overflow is structurally routed away from the main iron loop. You can see these valves everywhere if you know what to look for. In Canada, this structural valve is literal. The notwithstanding clause is built directly into their constitutional framework. It allows legislatures to temporarily bypass strict fundamental rights to release overwhelming political pressure. It's not a flaw. It's a valve designed specifically to keep the national structure from cracking under the weight of an unyielding absolute. In the United States, we see the same mechanics. A recent Supreme Court ruling granting presidential immunity for official acts functions as the exact same kind of mechanism. If you strip away the politics and just look at the structure, it is a mandatory exception, a valve deemed necessary to keep the executive branch flowing without grinding to a complete halt under the crushing pressure of rigid legal challenges. So we finally have a name for this behavior. This authorized deviation from absolute rules is called administrative discretion. It is the system structurally acknowledging that it simply must create loopholes to process what strict, rigid law cannot survive. The loophole isn't a bug in the code, it is a highly engineered survival tactic. But of course, this directly betrays the original design, the 19th century formalist conception of the rule of law, famously articulated by jurist A.V. Dicey, desperately demanded the absolute supremacy of regular law. It explicitly sought to exclude arbitrary power or discretion. The whole goal was a perfectly sealed, perfectly equal iron pipe, with absolutely no deviations permitted. But because the fluid of society just keeps expanding, that primary relief valve triggers constantly, daily, hourly. The system physically begins sprouting a complex network of secondary pipes just to route the constant excess pressure away. The temporary, rare exception morphs into permanent infrastructure, completely altering the shape of the system. A massive, irreversible lock-in of this infrastructure happened in 1941 within the American legal system. The sheer, overwhelming volume of an industrial society threatened total systemic judicial overload. The compromise wasn't ideological, it was structural. Procedural administrative rules officially replaced ordinary courts for countless daily functions. The overflow pipes officially became the main plumbing. And this is where the constraint becomes irreversible. Discretionary agencies, authorized deviations, and legal loopholes continuously multiplied. Eventually, they overtook the original rigid rules in both sheer volume and daily function. The exceptions literally became the primary operating structure of the state, entirely eclipsing the iron loop they were originally built to protect. The architecture we're left with today is an unrecognizable, incomprehensible maze of secondary pressure relief systems, which were themselves built to manage the overflow of the first. The original, clean, rigid loop is entirely buried under its own survival mechanisms. Trying to trace a single drop of fluid through this tangled mess, it's basically an impossibility. Because this cycle is inescapable. First, rules create pressure. Anytime a rigid, static rule is applied to a highly dynamic, ever-changing reality, it inherently generates systemic friction. The unyielding boundary restricts the flow, and the flow physically pushes back with increasing force. Second, that pressure physically necessitates exceptions. Without a localized valve, the entire system simply ruptures. The creation of a loophole in this context isn't corruption, it's a structural survival imperative. The system opens a valve because the only alternative is complete and total destruction. Third, and this is the real trap, exceptions require rules. To manage all these new relief valves and ensure they aren't just being used randomly, the system has to formalize them into highly specific secondary rules, which, of course, instantly restarts the pressure cycle, demanding yet another localized valve. The intended rule and the required exception are not opposing forces. They are structurally dependent on one another. The rigid rule generates the pressure that births the exception. The exception prevents the rule from being destroyed. One literally cannot structurally exist without the other. And the ultimate result? The fluid inside is now forced into chaotic, entirely unpredictable paths through an endless, tangled maze of secondary valves and rules about valves. Think about the irony. The original iron loop was built to guarantee perfect predictability, but the structural cost of keeping it alive was total unpredictability. So when we look at the endless proliferation of legal loopholes, administrative red tape, and unpredictable outcomes today, we naturally get frustrated. We point fingers and say the system is broken, but the mechanics reveal a much more inevitable structural reality. The system was never failing. It was simply following its structure.